I've moved here. Well, I don't actually know how long ago now. Maybe 8 years ago now. I've been in Wales for half my life. I don't actually have any historic connection beyond having moved here, but I developed a connection very quickly to the area. I feel because Ely is. It's hard to explain. I grew up in England, in southeast England specifically, on an estate, a council estate called the Millmead. And you might have heard of the Millmead, but it sort of depends on your age. But like when I was growing up, the Millmead and Ely were mentioned sort of within the same breath quite a lot. And I find it quite funny that like almost by accident I ended up in Ely. But there's a lot of parallels between the two areas, and I found that very quickly after moving here. And particularly since last year, I feel very, very rooted here. Since what everybody else has referred to as a riot, I am steadfastly calling the Ely uprising last May 22nd, which is a day after my birthday, in fact. Since then, I feel very rooted in the community, and I feel very determined to do what I can for the community, because I feel like there's been a lot of effort from inside within the community to try to do something since then. Well, Ely's in Cardiff West, so it's right in the heart of the constituency. You could say it's very near the middle of the constituency now, especially with the boundary change, including Pontyclun. So it's kind of on the edge of the city. It's a place where sometimes it's hard to get a taxi to. Because like I have regular fires at my house, like not in the house but out back, and I had a disabled friend coming round, and they got dropped, I guess, about 400 yards up the road because they refused to come up my road, which I genuinely don't know why. Like we have crime here, but it's not tremendously higher than other parts of the city that are like equally isolated in terms of geography. So like it's basically, I think that like a lot of the crime here is because it's been marginalized by the rest of the city, and that's because it was a council estate, because it was social housing, and because of marginalization to do with that. And as I've said in my manifesto, I think that a lot more has been taken out of Ely than has been given back over the years. And I think people are due something back. So essentially what was happening was it's important to put it into context first, I think. There's a complex relationship between young people and the police in this area. And by complex, I mean that from the perspective of the police, they're up to no good, these young'uns. Right. But from the perspective of the young people, they're just young people being young, having a slightly different culture to the police. And that's an important thing to note, is that there are cultural differences in Ely, because if you look at the census will not tell you the full story about this area. And that's true for a lot of parts of Cardiff. And it's because of a history of marginalisation and a history of this city in particular being racist. And what I mean by that is that there has been a history of segregation of housing in this particular city. So people came to understand that if you were too open about your history, you got sent to the worst parts of the city, the parts where the services were degraded because they weren't properly funded, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of mistrust. And so that means that with things like the census, they don't actually reflect the makeup of the area at all. And what happened was that the police, to my knowledge, even before this occurred, like I was aware of it happening. It's not something I only became aware of afterwards. The police had previously harassed young people in the area who were on dirt bikes. And what I mean by harassed is they just follow them down the road. And they follow them sometimes a little bit too close, and then they back off. And they're not pursuing them, right? And it's key to stress that, because from the police perspective, they're not doing anything particularly wrong. But obviously, from the kids' perspective, it's adversarial. And even if nothing really particularly comes of it, they obviously race all the way home. They tell their parents, oh, the police were harassing me again. And it gets this sentiment up in the community that means that the police aren't trusted. So when the police essentially killed 2 kids here, because they did. They chased them down the street, and I've seen CCTV, and we did some maths on the speed they were going past the Camry, but the closing time between the bike and the van, and they were going faster than the speed limit. So if I'd been on a dirt bike when I was a teenager and I'd been pursued by police, I would have been panicking. So I think it's important to understand that these were two kids who'd been riding dirt bikes for quite a long time. They were experienced with them. So it was surprising to their community that they'd crashed the bike. And I think the explanation is pretty obvious. It's that they were being chased by the police and they were scared. And the police, I think, knew this. I mean, immediately. I don't think they were in any doubt about this at all. Because what they made sure to do was where they set up the cordon, they divided the community in two. And at the time, I understood that this was a cause of some problems, but I didn't actually understand what was happening. And in the media, I said at the time that I thought that people didn't understand what was happening and that a lack of information had caused it. But I was actually wrong. What happened was that the people on the other side of the street, on Snowdon Road side of the cordon, they knew what had happened, and they were on social media telling people. And the people on this side of the street didn't know what was happening, but some of them were getting sort of fragmentary information. So they were like, the police have killed two kids. The people on the other side of the road knew, and the police refused to let the families near the bodies, which is what started everything in the first place. It's what started disagreements, I'm going to call them, between the police and particularly, I believe, local youths who were friends and relatives of the kids in question. And so it was all extremely avoidable. And I think emblematic of how avoidable it was when I first arrived, which was about 20 minutes after the incident. I arrived on Wilson Road, which is like Snowdon Road goes on to Wilson Road. And I arrived to see a police officer pushing a teenager. Very hard as well, not like just a little get away from me shove, but trying to push him over. And as I sort of ran over, because I was anxious about what was happening, he shoved him again harder. And I was like, he's trying to get him to hit him. He's trying to start a fight so they can arrest him. And so without really thinking about it, I got myself between the police officer and the youngster. And I tried to talk him down. And the attitude I got from the copper, it's on Twitter, I posted about it at the time. The attitude I got from the copper was disgusting. He wanted to fight me, which is just like, if a member of the public comes over and says, you're going too far, the correct response is not to try to fight them. And none of the police on either side of him cared or paid any attention. And I repeatedly tried to get information for local residents, because I was able to say I had connections to certain organisations in the area and things like that. And so there was a chance the police would talk to me. But even then, they only told me oh, yes, we're going to let them in a minute. That was the most information I was able to get out of them. And so with so little information and with so little ability to communicate or get into their houses, people became more and more annoyed. And I think that's only natural. There were people around the same time, about 40 minutes after it happened, there were people saying in the street, if they don't sort this, there's going to be real trouble. And I think that was inevitable. And I think it's inevitable anywhere where you go and kill people's children and then invade their neighborhood and tell them they're not allowed to go near the bodies. You do that anywhere, that's not going to have a positive response. And you do it somewhere where people have been marginalized for decades, it's going to be much worse. I think money, fundamentally. I mean, the people here are deprived. The area is deprived. If you walk around here and then you walk around somewhere else in the city, like Pontcanna, for example, you'll immediately notice the difference. In Pontcanna, they have a tree problem. The trees are wrecking the pavements, but the place still looks a ton better than here. And that tells you something. It tells you that they've committed to the infrastructure in Pontcanna, and it's because rich people live there. It's the same thing around some parts of Cardiff Bay. Not Cardiff Bay, further south, Penarth, where money has just been poured in, and also into Cardiff Bay, to be fair. But that was to relocate poor people. It should be remembered. Cardiff Bay is properly known as Tiger Bay, and the forced relocations that happened there are emblematic of Cardiff's very racist history. And I don't think there's an easy way back from that, essentially, other than a lot of money. that there needs to be a lot of money spent on social projects, and those projects need to be led by local people. They need to be the social projects that are chosen by the people here, and that's why I want to set up the Cardiff West Assembly. It's why Harmony wants to set up the Cardiff West Assembly here. It's because it's sort of an ideal place to demonstrate how democracy itself can be a healing way forwards for a community, because it enables us to say, these are the things we want, these are the things we need, and it enables the community to together take action to try to get them, even if members of that community wouldn't normally be able to do that. So I think my campaign is almost entirely about the idea of empowering the community via the assembly. So Harmony's position on this is that we want to hold a constitutional congress, and we want to set up regional assemblies across the UK to carry out that. So it wouldn't just be like inviting 50 people into a room and they sort it and then we all live with it. Instead, what we would do is we would set up an elaborate, probably multi-year process. If you think back to Brexit, think of that, but like well managed. That would be the goal. Not Brexit itself, but like the debate in public, the focus. And the idea would be we would have all of the discussions, all of them, like literally all of them, like everything. How do we want everything to work? How do we make things fairer? What is Britain? Does Britain include Wales? Does Britain include Scotland? Does it include Yorkshire even? Does it include Cornwall? Do we want to be in a loose kind of arrangement, or do we want to have a tight arrangement? These are all questions we haven't really thought about or answered in decades or centuries. And I do think it's about time. I remember in the 1990s, there were questions of like, what is Britain? Like, what's our role in the world now that we're not having our foot on everyone's neck all the time? And like, it would be good to actually answer that rather than just sort of kick it to the curb, which is what we've done. I think to give my answer of what I would be arguing for, I would be arguing for something like Harmony, essentially. I think that regionalised and constituency assemblies, where people can advocate for themselves clearly in a direct democratic arrangement, I think it's much more workable than people understand. I think there's quite a lot of historic basis for that being workable that people don't really know about, because the understanding is quite new. For example, I point to David Graeber and David Wengrow's recent-ish book. I've mixed it up with another one. Hang on. Dawn of Everything. I'd point to that. There's examples in there of cities that were run in this way, for example, and they ran for many hundreds of years with very little problems. There's no reason why we can't do it, and I think I think also with the dual system that we use in Harmony, with because we have advocacy assemblies as well, so we have non-geographical assemblies that offer communities instead. So, for example, we have a community for disabled people, which means that disabled people can lead on their own issues, with the ethos of nothing about you without you. I think that kind of arrangement with a mix of geographical and non-geographical, open access, open participation assemblies is the way forwards, which people can like dip in and out of throughout their lives. Like if there's an issue that interests you, you can turn up. If there's not, you don't have to. And people will talk as well. So like if there's like a real problem happening, you'll hear about it in your community and you'll go, I'd best go along to the assembly. I haven't been for a while. And like I could see that as a real way we could actually live. And like there'd be no one to blame but ourselves if it went wrong. And I think that would be very refreshing. I think I'd like that. I would like it if everything went really wrong for once and I could say, do you know what? It's my fault as much as anyone's. That would be an amazing feeling. I don't think we've ever, any of us experienced that. And that would be such a privilege. What I'm promising is that we will take action. If I go to the Commons and I stand up and I say, this issue is plaguing Cardiff West, we need this to be solved. The people here have said they want this to happen, and we think this should happen in X time span. And whoever is in power doesn't do anything. If they don't act, we will take action directly. And I can point to examples of that. For example, we haven't managed to do very many of them yet, but I can point to examples. We wanted everyone to do more about the cost of living crisis. I and Harmony introduced a petition for emergency UBI in 2020 during the pandemic. Unfortunately, most of the left ignored that while calling for it by the same name, which was quite annoying. but we move. But that didn't happen. And we had like cost of living payments, but they weren't enough. So we thought about how we could act to try to ameliorate it. And although it's been very small scale, we've paid out more than £5,000 via the emergency payment fund since, in about 2 years, I think, which is not too bad given that almost all the fundraising has been done on social media and we haven't actually run any major fundraising events yet because we started online. And the thing is, when you start online during a pandemic, is you're really fragmented and it actually takes you a while to sort of form clumps that are big enough to do anything locally. But yes, the EPF has paid out more than £5,000 and it pays out £20 on a first come, first served basis. And that's an example of how you can just take direct action. Like you don't have to wait. And eventually when these funds start getting larger, when the solidarity funds start growing, it becomes more and more apparent that there's a problem as well. And people start talking about the problem, like with food banks, for example, right? Food banks didn't solve the problem and they didn't push people towards solving the problem entirely either, but they've done a little bit of both. And with other action around them joined up, they could change the problem down the road. It's just that it's not being done that way. Another example of that is our Ain't Asking campaign, which is a bit more grandiose and is only partly underway. And that is that we have a petition for universal free school meals. And that's sitting on, I think, just under 50,000 signatures at the moment. And the plan there is to build a pool of volunteers and fundraise and pay for the school meals at a school for a year. Essentially, we will just give the school the money. The idea being that we will do it in a very, very public, very, very overt way. We'll say we're running a universal free school meal trial here at this school. We'll get the school involved. We'll get the local, what's it called? Parent-teacher association involved. We'll get them fundraising as well for it. Everybody gets involved. The community feeds a school. And then we can say to the local MP, why are you not arguing for this? Look how easy it is. Even your constituents can do it. And I think that kind of activism, that kind of doing a portion of the problem, like a microcosm of solving the problem, of finding some way you can act to solve it. I think that's quite powerful. And I think if we could do that with like an insurgent MP in the Commons, I think that could actually have much more effect than people realise, especially because I think with action constantly spawning from a lack of action from the government, I think sooner or later that's going to really pick up quite a lot of media attention as well. And so it would give more voice to the community than they currently have by far. But of course, there is also the fact that we would be arguing for the entirety of Harmony's policy book, which includes things like UBI. It includes things like a fair actual living wage. It includes things like pay scaling for the public sector, democratic pay scaling at that. So the idea there is that everybody every 3-4 years gets together and decides on what the maximum gap is between the top of the system and the bottom of the system. And if anything moves in between, everybody moves. So if anybody's pay goes up, everybody's pay goes up by a set amount. And that means that you can't overpay people at the top, because if you do, then it means everybody else has to get paid and the system collapses. So we want to introduce that. We also have a policy relating to the media. It's just that we want the entirety of the media to be converted to cooperatives, majority owned by their workers. We're fine with having like a minority ownership of investors. I don't see a problem with that, to be honest with you. But I think it's a better approach to media freedom. We don't want to tie the media down. We want to free the media. And I think that this is a really good route to doing it. It's a good route to also to signaling to journalists that we're on your side. We know that many of you would actually like to be writing the truth, but would lose your livelihoods and die if you didn't, which obviously sucks. But like more locally, there's lots of policies in the policy book to point to. I actually have it open so I could point to them. I have many of them memorized, but there's things like at the NHS, bringing dentistry, eye care, and or GP services into the NHS is a policy. We kind of want to ban private healthcare. There's some pushback within the party, particularly from trans people, on that because it looks risky to them. But we have a sort of broad consensus on that. It might flux, to be fair, but we also want to set up a national care service alongside the NHS. because it's clear that care isn't working, either in the community or in care homes. The system's broken, and I think COVID proved that beyond all doubt, that you can't have private care services. It's far too dangerous for the service users. Literally tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands, possibly. I'm not actually sure of the number of elderly people exactly that died in care homes, but a very, very large number of people died in care homes because of deliberate choices that couldn't have been made if we had a national care service with much tighter quality of care and much tighter rules and regulations on things like disease control. There's just a huge amount of stuff. There's also like improving cycling, plastic bottle deposit schemes. There's stuff like tackling antisocial behaviour through, it's a slightly complicated argument, but through police abolition, which I know sounds strange, but we want to replace the police entirely, want to do away with the police and instead have a full spectrum of public services that do all of the things the police do. So you'd have specialised teams, and the idea would be that these teams would collaborate with one another, and they would be, modular, that's the word. So in different areas, these different services would be modular, and they would be able to form teams appropriate to certain situations. The idea would be to have long-term and short-term analysis teams as well, who would be tasked with specifically looking at what government needs to do in an area to reduce crime. So like a public health approach to crime, effectively, which I'm aware is going to be remarkably complicated to argue in a public space, but what the hell, why not? We're going to be running quite a different campaign. It's going to be a very social campaign, is probably the best way to put it. I'm going to be getting out in the community quite a lot and talking to people directly, not just door knocking, but setting up in high footfall places and just chatting with people, handing out the manifesto and, getting people talking. And people are energized by it so far. So that's perhaps something that's a little different, because we're offering something quite different, and none of the other campaigns are really offering it, so far as I'm aware. I mean, maybe one of them's come up with something new that I haven't heard yet, but I think also there's the fact that I've promised to give up most of my wage if I'm elected. So I currently live on universal credit, so to me it's still a pay rise. But I've committed to basically taking no more than minimum wage, and the rest would then be donated to mutual aid projects in the constituency itself. So that's like a way that we can immediately commit something back to the community rather than taking from it. Also, because I don't want to move too far away. Like I wouldn't want to be elected and then move over to Pontcanna into a nice studio and forget why the hell I was being elected in the first place, because that is what happens. And it's almost impossible to avoid it. It's impossible to avoid it, and also because like I'm going to have to get a place in London, and that place in London is going to be nicer than my place here, and I'm going to be spending time there. So I'm going to be spending time in a nicer place. So I think it's good if I can't afford too much of a nicer place, right? And I think this is something more politicians should do. I think the wage is too high to start with. I think politicians are paid more than firefighters, and are they more important than firefighters? I think they're more replaceable much more quickly. Like you could replace the whole House of Commons in 5 days, and I don't think it would make a vast difference. I'm also really keen not to badmouth any of the other candidates, except for the landlord. The Workers' Party candidate is a landlord, which is unexpected. He's an Airbnb landlord, and he was posting about it on his Facebook account, on his campaign Facebook account. I asked a friend of mine to look into the candidates. I did not expect that at all. I was expecting like you to come back and say, oh yeah, he's on his Instagram account, his private Instagram account, talking about how he's a landlord. Not, oh yeah, he's in the clear, in the open on his campaign account, talking about how everyone should go over to Airbnb. Another major difference is there's a strong connection to the Palestine Solidarity campaign in Cardiff. For example, we're going to be putting that on our leaflets. I'm devoting half of all of our leaflet space to Palestine Solidarity. So we're going to be, on Friday, when we start handing out leaflets, we'll be handing out leaflets urging people to join the protest on Saturday. And which I think is important. I think it's the most important thing happening right now is what's happening in Palestine and in Sudan. And so I think it's really important that we devote time to that, and we're going to be devoting time to talking about what's happening in Sudan as well. I think which is especially important right now with the temperatures that are being seen in northern Sudan and southern Egypt, with people fleeing from Sudan into Egypt only to be returned by the Egyptian military, which is it's unfathomably cruel. But yeah, I think that there's probably a few things that set my campaign apart, but also the fact that I'm poor and disabled. I have no real starting resources, but my campaign team is very experienced, so that's something. I present an opportunity to people to vote for an honest politician for probably the only time in their lives, other than maybe Jeremy, because I've been on social media for 4 years now. No one has ever caught me out in a lie, and I'm not like bragging or anything. I just don't lie. It's not in my. There's no need to, and that's also the thing that's going to set my campaign apart. Is the fact I'm not going to be telling lies. If we mess up, we'll own it. You might have noticed that in this call, I've said some things and gone, no, that's not right. I'm just going to own it. It's not a problem. If we make mistakes, we'll fix them. And that's something that you can't count on from most candidates. Most candidates, they're secretly under the surface. They have no idea what to do if it goes wrong. I know what to do if it goes wrong. This campaign is not just about Cardiff West, although we will be putting Cardiff West first with the Assembly. It's also about the rest of the country, because this can be a historic moment for Harmony, for Cardiff West. Harmony was born in Fairwater in Cardiff West, so it has its roots here entirely. So it would be very fitting for our first MP to be elected here, and it would also be quite amazing if we could have the first MP elected for the party before our actual hard launch had entirely commenced. But I think that there's an opportunity for them to vote for themselves. That's how we're putting it in the document, is to vote for you, vote for yourself, because that's the opportunity that's being offered, is to be able to send their own words to Westminster. Because I will hash it out in the Assembly with people. We will talk it out. We will write stuff up in shared documents, as we do in Harmony already, and we will take their words to Parliament. And as it stands, the experience I've had the last 7-8 months with writing letters to local MPs is they just don't listen. They don't care, particularly with an election in the offing, that suddenly their ears are closed. All they're doing is party discipline. And that reveals so much about what their priorities are genuinely. So I think the opportunity here is to do it completely differently, and also to tell them that we want it different, because there's not many opportunities to do that. And I think this is actually a good one, as opposed to Brexit, which was a terrible one. We didn't need that kind of protest, not with the Tories in power anyway. I think our addiction to genocide is probably the biggest problem the country is facing, both internally and externally. That's rooted in our authoritarianism. So I guess the authoritarianism, the verticality of our society is a huge problem. It's far too much for most people to scale, but there's a constant sort of communication that is possible when it isn't. I think that's the main problem. I think hierarchy ultimately, but I would say that. I think hierarchy is ultimately the biggest problem facing the UK, because we're unable to move to the extent that most people can't detect the chains that are holding them down. So I think if we can clear away some of the chains, if we can make the weight a little bit lighter, people will actually start to notice how oppressed they are, and just how much freedom enables you to change things. Like even a small amount of freedom, a small amount of democracy can make a big difference. There's not many people in Harmony. There's just a few hundred of us, but we've managed to raise thousands of pounds to help people and get 50,000 signatures, which you'll notice something like 100 times more than we have people in the party. And most of that was just done by emailing people. The media completely ignored us when we were doing that campaign. So literally just emailing people, talking to people, that you can achieve so much more than people realize just by acting. And I think that opens up possibilities. And I think that's the way to approach Britain's problems as well, is from the ground up. I think the main core of the message is that we can do a lot more than we think we can. Sometimes the first step is like I know it's such a ridiculous cliche, but the first step is the hardest one. 4 years ago, when I first said I was standing, harmony didn't really exist yet. It was just a thing. And I said at the time, if at the next general election, harmony doesn't have candidates standing, I will stand so that it gives us a platform for a hard launch. But what I didn't know then was that we were actually going to have helped people and potentially even had some influence. There's policy changes that have occurred that I'm not entirely sure we haven't had some influence on, most notably in London. So I'm going to reveal this. We were planning to run a free school meal trial in Keir Starmer's constituency. And we put out contact to the people in that area. And within 2 weeks, Labour announced a free school meal package in London. So I'm not sure that was connected, and maybe they were already planning to do it. But it, like the littlest nudges sometimes can have big impacts.